So thanks so much, Rachel. I'm excited to be here. It's so fun to see a lot of familiar faces. So it's nice to be here and have a chance to talk with you. So Rachel mentioned that I work for Mennonite Mission Network, and that is the case. I work from a little office above my garage in Oklahoma, and it's wonderful. Part of my work over the last maybe 3 years at Mission Network has been working on adjusting our harassment prevention and child safety policies. And then we started the process about 3 years ago thinking about training, like how do we train all these different people, right? Groups of people, staff, and our volunteers who are working for maybe a week or a month or a year, and they're in different places or different countries. And so really trying to figure out how we're going to get information in front of folks that they need. And so part of the work that I took on then was finding some trainings that I could take that helped me to be able to put together those trainings. So I spent some time being trained by an organization in Canada called Plan to Protect. I don't know if anybody has heard of that organization, but it's a pretty large organization that works with schools and churches across Canada and the US, really working at both helping them to get policy down and then also training. And so I was trained by them, and I've gone through trainings with the Faith Trust Institute. Some of you might have heard of them as well. They do a lot of good work thinking more about healthy boundaries with adults and pastors and that kind of thing. And so there's pieces from both of those organizations and some pieces from Dove's Nest that you'll see credited at the bottom of my slides. This isn't information that I'm making up, guys. I'm pulling together stuff from other sources and hopefully putting it together in a way that can be useful for us. So first I want to say too, good job you guys for being here today. Good job your church for having a policy and putting it into place and for making training a priority. It isn't glamorous work that we're doing today, so or the most fun conversation that anybody can have on a nice Sunday afternoon when it's actually nice outside. So I'm really glad that you're here anyway, and I hope that we can have a good conversation together. So we all choose to be a part of a church. I know you are because you're here, right? And we do that because we believe that churches can be a good thing. Churches and faith-based organizations provide a lot of positive things, right? Spiritual guidance and concrete services, sometimes helping people with tangible things like food and shelter and clothing. Churches provide social support, right? Connecting people to a community physically and emotionally and socially. We need that from each other. Churches provide leadership and training opportunities. And a really important one is churches are a place where they can nurture and listen to children. A piece of research that I read said that the number one thing that teens want from church is for adults to listen to them and to take them seriously. That's pretty significant. But I think it's also important for us to name why our churches and faith-based organizations can also be vulnerable at times. Because sometimes we're in denial when that abuse might exist. We might say, oh no, that would never happen in our community. We know each other. We've grown up together. Or sometimes what I hear in my church even is, well, we're just a big family here. We all know each other. We would know if something were going to happen. Right? But that makes us vulnerable, right? Sometimes we trust too much. When we need a volunteer to do something, when we need another Sunday school teacher, when someone says they'll do it, we trust their intentions, right? We don't question that because we need them to be. The problem is that when we expect the best in everyone, which we should be able to do, it creates a high trust, which is also a high risk situation, right? When we're not paying attention to what the risk may be in those high trust situations, we are more at risk. And sometimes churches think that they can take care of allegations themselves, right? They might be afraid of news getting out, or maybe feeling the need to protect a high-profile member of the church, and so they feel like they can take care of things themselves. That puts us in a very vulnerable spot. And sometimes churches don't have or don't implement protection policies. Thankfully, that's not the case for you guys. So this next slide comes from some information that actually comes from some writing that an Amish author has done. And he's talking about times when the Anabaptist community, the strengths of the Anabaptist community can also become a weakness for us. And I thought these three were really helpful for us to think about a little bit. So a forgiving attitude is central to our faith, right? We all need that. We talk about that. We value that. We know that we're to forgive because Christ has forgiven us, but we have to be careful with that because sometimes that focus on forgiveness may push us to ask for forgiveness too soon or ask a targeted person to forgive an offender too soon. And that can diminish the harm that has been done or maybe even keep us from really working at preventing it from happening again. Anabaptist communities are traditionally close communities, right? And that's a wonderful thing. We need that support. We need to be a family together. But it also makes it harder then to name when something is maybe inappropriate. It makes us a bit more likely to explain it away. Surely I misunderstood what they said. I'm sure they wouldn't mean that, right? And also our emphasis on peace can lend itself at times to maybe not paying attention to risky behaviors that we see, or simply as Mennonites wanting to avoid conflict. So we have to be aware of those things. So what's the purpose of boundaries, right? Boundaries maintain the integrity of the relationships between you and those that you serve. So in this case, we're talking about you and the children of your church, right? They protect you also and make trust and relationships with children possible. They protect you against false allegations, and they empower you to observe and report inappropriate behavior. Those are all positive things. They also help us to fulfill our mandate as Christians to protect children. So here's just a bit of one of those scriptures that helps us to think about what that is. Matthew 18, 2 through 7. Would someone... Whew, those are pretty strong words, right? Millstone tied around the neck, drown in the deep sea. Like, that's pretty serious stuff here. How great is our responsibility, for sure. So a concept that I like to think about that I think is helpful for us in thinking about boundaries is the difference between boundary crossings and boundary violations. So boundary crossings are a natural part of life. They happen all the time. Anytime you touch another person, or give them a hug, or shake their hand, you cross a boundary, a physical boundary, right? Anytime you ask someone a personal question, you're crossing an emotional or a social boundary. So boundary crossings, right, in and of themselves are not necessarily bad things. In fact, they're really, really important. You can't build a relationship with another person or a child if you don't cross some boundaries, right? That's important. But boundary violations, on the other hand, occur when that boundary crossing is not in the best interest of the other person and results in harm. So perhaps commenting on a person's appearance maybe was meant to be complimentary, but if it made them uncomfortable, it was a boundary violation, even if you didn't intend it to be. So the key to knowing the difference is to consider, for what purpose and in whose interest am I crossing this boundary, right? It could be the same activity. I could hug a child after Sunday school, right, on a Sunday morning. And that could easily be just a boundary crossing. But if that hug made the child uncomfortable, and they didn't want that hug, it was a boundary violation, even if you weren't intending it, right? We'll talk a little bit more about how to watch for those. But Jesus provides us a valuable paradigm, I think, for understanding the difference between boundary crossings and boundary violations. Jesus crossed boundaries all the time, right? He ate with sinners. He touched lepers, for Pete's sake, right? He talked with women. He healed on the Sabbath. He crossed boundaries all the time, but they were not intending to harm the other person, right? He crossed those boundaries to bring healing and hope. And that's our goal as well. So I'd like for us to take a few moments now in your table groups to just talk together, name the boundary crossings that happen in your church. What are the boundary crossings that you see on a regular basis here? And then maybe also, what could be the boundary violations that could happen if someone's not paying attention? Okay, so we'll just take about 2-3 minutes to talk about that. Boundary crossings that happen in your church. So each of those boundary crossings that you named, remember that they could be a boundary violation if the other person's interest is not taken into account. It's when our needs take priority, right, and we forget the importance of acting in the best interest of the other, that we are at increased risk of boundary violations. Good, so let's think a little bit about resources and power as we talk about boundaries with children. So the teacher or leader relationship, right, is one of unequal power between the teacher or leader and the children in their class, right? The teacher is older. The teacher brings, it's generally larger physically, brings resources to the classroom, and just by the nature of being an adult, you have a certain amount of power that you bring to a relationship with a child, and a certain amount of authority there, right? And that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing, right? Power isn't in and of itself a bad thing. The fact of unequal power doesn't necessarily indicate the presence of abuse. What makes a difference is how you use the power that you have, right? And I think that power can be a bit tricky for Mennonites. I think often we like to say that we don't want power. Maybe it's the whole pride thing, or I don't know, but we feel like it would be bad to say we want power, right? So we say we don't want power, and somehow we think that means the same thing as we don't have power. And that's just simply not true, right? It's when we don't acknowledge the power that we have that then we're at risk at abusing it. So simply just acknowledging the power that we bring and making sure that we're using that in a positive way and not for the harm of others, I think is really important for us. So let's take a look at the reality here, just a few statistics. In 2006, there was a study done by Conrad Carnegie of MCUSA. You guys might remember that. He put a book out after. So these statistics are just a few years old here. But I think they're, when we're looking particularly at MCUSA, this is a helpful statistic for us to consider. He found that 1 in 5 women reported having experienced sexual abuse, and 1 in 20 men. The CDC reports across the US that 1 in 4 girls, right, has experienced some sort of sexual abuse, and 1 in 6 boys. So I think there's lots of theories about that men actually underreport abuse. So I don't know if that statistic is true or not, but we're not very far off, especially for women. We're not far off the national average, which means we in the church, we're not any different. We're not exempt, right? We're not safe just because we're in a church. It's happening within the church as well. Being aware of adult-child relationships is important, as well as adolescent and child relationships, because 23% of child abuse is perpetrated by older children or an adolescent. So that's important that we're paying attention and watching what's happening with the different age groups of children in our midst as well. We also know that 90% of abuse occurs with someone that the child has an established and trusting relationship with, and often someone in a position of authority. 90%, right? That's pretty high. When I was younger, we talked a lot about stranger danger, right? That's a myth. That doesn't help us anymore. Unfortunately, it's somebody that we know often. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I like to think about it this way, as we're thinking about the importance of boundaries. So I did a little bit of research, and I found that 1.3 million children participate in amateur softball and baseball leagues every year in the US. 1.3 million, that's a lot of kids, right? And according to Johns Hopkins, 3 to 4 children die each year due to baseball injuries. So that's about 1 in every 325,000. About 112,000 children go to the ER every year due to baseball injuries, so about 1 in 12, right? Would we ever consider letting our children play baseball without the proper protective gear? Absolutely not. Even though only 1 in 325,000 die every year, right? The statistics for child abuse are 1 in 4, friends. We can't not put protection on them, right? And that's what we're doing today. This is so important. This is the safety gear. Your policies, your procedures, and talking about this together is the safety gear that we're putting on our kids, and it's important. Let's talk a little bit about the 4 types of abuse. So physical abuse is any non-accidental physical injury to a child. So let's say you're a Sunday school teacher and a child comes into your classroom in the morning and they have a adult-sized red handprint right on their cheek, right? Seems like that might be something I need to be concerned about. I really don't know what happened though. I don't know, do I quickly make a report or what can I do to know? Is this something that I really need to be worried about? If we see something like this that we're really unsure about, you can always ask a non-leading question. Now, we're not supposed to investigate, right? We know all that. We have very good reporting mechanisms in the US for where exactly we're supposed to be doing those things. But if we don't know, if we need to be worried, we can always ask a non-leading question. So a non-leading question would be one like, ooh, tell me what happened. Or tell me a little bit more about this. A leading question would be, did your big brother slap you? Or did daddy slap you? Or something like that, right? So you see the difference there? Just a simple, ooh, tell me a little bit about this. Can get you to know if I need to be worried or not, right? Just a simple non-leading question. Okay, so sexual abuse occurs when a child is used for the sexual gratification of an adult or an older child. So that could be things like sexual touching or intentional exposure or sexual manipulation. So let's say you're teaching a second grade class. Okay, when I go and help teach the 1st through 3rd grade class at my church, my daughter is in that class. Some of you know her. I have found that, these kids ask to pray for everything, right? We pray for kitties, we pray for scratches. My Ellie last year asked if she had a pet grasshopper, and we prayed for a pet grasshopper. She really kept this grasshopper for like a few days. It was really, poor guy. But anyway, we asked, we prayed for a pet grasshopper, okay? We pray for anything. But let's say one day in your class, a child asked to pray that Grandpa would stop kissing me. Ooh, okay. Not sure what to do with that, right? Do we need to be worried? Well, let's ask a non-leading question and see where it gets us, right? And see if we need to be worried. So tell me a little bit more about that, right? That's the non-leading question I like to put in my pocket, right? I like to think about those kinds of questions. I've got it in my pocket, so when the moment occurs, I don't have to actually use my thinking brain, right? I can just pull it out of my pocket and ask. Tell me a little bit more about that, right? You can come up with one that's very similar, whatever works for you, but I'd encourage you to put one in your pocket so you don't have to wonder and think. So I might say, tell me a little bit more about that. Well, every morning, Grandpa walks me up to the school and all of my friends are standing around and he gives me a kiss on the cheek to tell me goodbye, and it's so embarrassing. Right? That's a very different answer from what my mind probably first went to, right? But asking that non-leading question can just get us enough to know. And if the child's answer is very different from that and you're worried, no more questions, right? Then you don't need to ask. And we don't need to ask those necessarily in front of the other kids. That could be after class, after the others, or if you're doing a craft, just quietly to just that child. But ask those non-leading questions so that we know if we need to be worried. Okay, emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior that attacks a child's emotional development, sense of self-worth, dignity, and identity. So things like constant criticism or teasing or belittling, insulting, rejecting, ignoring, or isolating a child, right? And just like with the others, if we're concerned about those things, we ask a non-leading question that might get us to a little bit more information so we know if we need to be worried. Okay, neglect also then is the failure of a parent or guardian to provide for the child to the degree that the child is threatened with harm. So again, non-leading questions. it's important for us to know that neglect is the most common form of abuse in broader society, right? Sexual abuse is the most common within the church. And it's the most underreported because it's the most difficult for a child to disclose, right? So what do we need to be watching for? I think grooming is a term. Have you guys heard the term grooming over the last few years? It's kind of gained in popularity, and I think sometimes it puts us a little bit on edge. Makes us, maybe some, a little worried about even investing in the lives of children, right? I wouldn't want to do something that makes someone suspicious of me, right? But grooming is not building a relationship with the child, or even building a special relationship with a child, right? Grooming is building a relationship with the intention of taking advantage of them, right? So that's very different. So what you might see as you're watching around you, watching the children in your community, what you might see in someone who could be grooming a child is someone who's especially preoccupied with one child, or maybe several children from the same family, and always wanting to be just with those children. They might insist on being physical with the child, right? So always hugging, always picking them up, always having them on their lap, things like that. Might be a red flag. It might be one who continually tries to make time alone with that child, always wanting to take them somewhere, take them, to the store with them, or take them wherever. Might be a red flag. Someone maybe who makes inappropriate comments about a youth's looks or body, or someone who encourages a child to lie to their parents or to keep a secret. Certainly a red flag there, right? So these are things just for us to be aware of and watching for, but certainly not intended for us to be suspicious or to be hesitant to build relationships with children. So what can we do? We know that, as I said before, over 90% of abuse happens with someone that the child knows already and often even has an established relationship with. So we know stranger danger is a myth, and we don't want to instill undue fear in our children, but it's important to remember that it really can be anyone. And so we want to help our children to learn healthy boundaries for their own bodies and what to do if someone attempts to cross those, right? So a couple of ways to work at that. Circles of Grace is a curriculum that the Dove's Nest has created. Do you guys use Circles of Grace here? Okay, so I'll just tell you about it. I'd encourage you to check it out. You can get access to all of their curriculum through Dove's Nest, and they have like a curriculum for every age group, for every grade. And it's I really like the curriculum. We use it at our church with the children once a year. And it really just helps them to have some language around keeping their bodies safe. It doesn't talk about someone touching you inappropriately like right away. It's not real out there. It's just a really nice way to think about the space around us, and God is in our circle of grace, and if someone makes us uncomfortable in our circle of grace, what to do with that, and how to handle that. It talks about anything, using words and language that the younger ones can understand, and then there's even some material that high schoolers can relate to as well. So that's one way, just to help our children to begin to think about boundaries with their bodies. At my house, since we don't talk about not talking to strangers, we talk about tricky adults. The difference between tricky adults and trustworthy or safe adults, right? So a tricky adult might be someone who asks you to do something that really another adult should be doing. I wonder if maybe that's a tricky adult. A tricky adult asks you maybe to go somewhere with them without telling your mom or dad. Ooh, maybe that's a tricky adult. A tricky adult might be one who gives you a gift and asks you not to tell your mom or dad, right? Maybe a tricky adult. A tricky adult might be one who asks you to keep a secret from your parents. So I talk about this with my kids, now they roll their eyes. Yes, Mom, tricky adult. But I want them to hear, right? I want them to be thinking about that. The first time I asked Ellie, when she's like 4, if someone gave you a piece of candy and asked you to come with them, or tried to give you a piece of candy, what would you do? She said, yes! And that scares me. So we talk about, no, no. We don't do that, right? Children really often do just trust, and we have to, I don't want her to be afraid to relate to people. I don't want her to be afraid to relate to adults, but I want her to be thinking about is this a situation that maybe I should, this should set off a little red flag inside. This might be a tricky adult, and I know what I'm supposed to do is go and find my mom or my dad right away. Good, so another thing that we can do is to follow our policy and procedures. I know you guys have that in place in your congregation, and that is great. So if you're in a situation and you're not sure what you should do, ask someone else who's in leadership, find out, right? So you know your next steps. And we can also model healthy boundaries in our own relationships with children and with other adults. So what's one way that we can start thinking about modeling healthy boundaries is to consider touch. I think it's really important for us to think about that. So touch is a really big part of our lives, right? We can all imagine a good touch that we've had probably in the last day or two, right? If you think about a good touch that you've had, it makes you feel safe, it makes you feel affirmed, welcomed. If someone shook your hand when you walked in this morning, and you feel welcomed and affirmed, right? Those are good touches. A bad touch then, on the other hand, makes the receiver feel bad about themselves, right? Or maybe afraid, or might be manipulated. You might be feeling manipulated in some way. That's a bad touch. I'm sure all of us can remember in our minds some sort of bad touch that we've experienced. But more common than good or bad touch for children is confusing touch, right? Confusing touch makes the receiver feel uneasy or unsure. And it's important for us to remember that really youth and children experience confusing touch more than either good or bad. We don't know what's going on in their little minds at any given time. We don't know what the last touch they had before they got to our class was. And if it was a bad touch, our good touch that we intended to be good could be received as confusing or even bad, even without our intention. And because the thing is, guys, we don't get to decide for them whether it was good or bad touch, right? Intentions are irrelevant. Whether a touch is good, bad, or confusing is determined by how the receiver experiences it, not by the intentions of the person doing the touching. So touch is such a huge part of our ministry and of most church settings. We don't need to be afraid to touch children. But we do want to make sure that our touch, which hopefully is intended to be good touch, is not received as bad or confusing. So what are the ways that we can work at that? One of the ways is that we can give children a choice, right? Giving them a choice about touch can be so empowering for them. So we can ask them before we hug a child. Or we could say, would you like a hug or a high five today? Or neither, right? So the idea isn't always just saying, can I hug you, right? But you can use some nonverbals there too. If a child comes at you with arms open, right, they obviously are looking for a hug. And that's okay, right? You can give them a hug to affirm them. But if a child is coming at you and their arms are down like this, or you hug them one time and you find them very stiff as a board, read those nonverbals, right? They don't really want a hug. Don't give them another one. So another thing that we can do is make sure that your touch is done in a public place, right? So not behind a closed door where there's no one else around. And it's important to remember that those who lack boundaries often are the ones who need us to help them learn to set boundaries in their lives, right? So those children that are always crawling up into your lap that may lack boundaries are the ones that are most vulnerable to being taken advantage of. So they may need you to help them set some boundaries in their life. So it might be, it's not okay for you to sit on my lap right now, but you can sit right here beside me. I'm happy to talk with you, right? Or to maybe a youth, it's, yes, I'd love to have a conversation with you. Let's meet at the coffee shop, right? In a public place. So I'm gonna give you an example. My daughter, I've talked already about Ellie. So about 3 years ago, we had a new associate pastor and his wife come to our church. And they were younger, they became good friends of ours, they came to our house, and those of you who know my daughter know she just loves with her whole heart, right? She's a wholehearted girl. And when she loves somebody, she throws her arms around them. So when we would come to church, I saw her on a Wednesday evening. Gabe and Krista, our friends, came in, and she ran over. She's just 5. She ran over and threw her arms around Gabe. Now, she was 5. She came to about here on Gabe. I saw his reaction, physically, do this. But I was so pleased with his response. He didn't push her away or not affirm her hug in any way. He patted her gently on the back, just a couple little pats, and then he took her shoulder, turned her around, took his hand down, and just got right down on her level. Tell me how your day was, Ellie. Tell me all about kindergarten, right? So he didn't push her, he didn't not affirm that relationship with her, but he didn't let that hug linger either. He helped her learn some boundaries, and I'm so grateful for that. So leaning down, as Gabe did in my example, leaning down and speaking right at eye level with a child is such a valuable, important way that you can just affirm them, that you are listening, you are on their level. You don't even have to touch them, right, to do that. But you can express a lot of care and affirmation just by getting on eye level with a child. So putting your arm around them or shoulder to comfort them when they need that, that's okay too. And sometimes just a pat is really all that they need. A pat for affirmation on their hand or their shoulder feels very different than a hand that lingers there much longer, right? Does this make sense? Are you guys with me? Is anybody hearing me say you shouldn't touch children? Please don't. That's not at all what I'm wanting to convey, but hopefully some helpful things to help us think about the way that we touch children. Good, so another concept that Faith Trust Institute talks about that I think is helpful for us to think about in this is the difference between wanderers versus predators. So wanderers are folks that wander across boundaries, right? And I think it's important for us to remember that we all have the potential to wander across boundaries at times. If we're not paying attention, we weren't thinking, oops, oh my goodness, I didn't realize, now we've gotten to a place, oh, I wandered across that boundary, right? And so, thinking about boundaries and conversations like we're having today hopefully helps wanderers to be more aware of that and set some parameters for them. But predators, on the other hand, cross boundaries intentionally and skillfully. They lack conscience and have limited self-awareness and seek to control others. So prevention and setting boundaries and all of that conversation isn't really helpful for a predator. And I think it's good for us to be thinking about the difference of those as we're thinking about our own potential to wander, but also as we think about those who might want to be a part of our church who have a past with that, right? Not every person who has that designation or who has been in trouble for some reason is a predator. Perhaps they wandered as well. Good, so what do we do if we hear or see abuse? Well, the first thing that we want to do is to believe the child. So we know that false accusations happen, but they are incredibly rare. Marie Fortune of Faith Trust Institute says that of the over 1,000 cases that she has dealt with in churches, only 4 were false reports. That's a pretty low percentage. So the first thing we want to do is to believe the child and to make sure that they feel and that they are safe, right? So we've asked hopefully those non-leading questions that we put in our pocket so that we know, and then we've followed our policy. We remember it's not up to us to investigate the situation, just ask those non-leading questions, maybe just one to get until we know, yes, we need to be worried. Then our questions can stop. And then we follow your church's Child Protection and Abuse Procedure document, which I assume you all have access to. So your document in section 5, I don't know if you guys have it in front of you, I looked at it. In section 5 it says your policy, your procedure is to notify Child Protective Services or the police right away. And then to file an incident report, which there is a document, a template for you to do that. Your policy expects that anyone involved in church activities is going to report. Right, so I did look up, in Kansas, not everyone is a mandated reporter. That's different. Oklahoma, every adult is a mandated reporter, but not in the state of Kansas. So you may not be legally liable to make a report, right? But your church is saying, if we work with children in our congregation, we're going to report. That's what we're asking each other to do. That's a good policy. I also found that in March of this year, maybe you guys know this already, those of you who are pastoral staff, in March of this year, the Kansas Senate approved a bill, State Bill 218, that adds members of clergy to the list of mandated reporters in Kansas. Now that's still in the House as far as I could find. And that doesn't necessarily change any of your expectations in your policy, but it may change the legal liability for your pastors. So be aware of that. Okay, so let's do just a couple of scenarios. Let's talk through a couple scenarios just for fun, right? So, during VBS, I don't know if you guys eat snacks or supper. We provide supper at our VBS, so that's where this, so I'm sorry if you don't. But at a church event, right, there's children eating, you look over, there's a child grabbing their throat, their face is red and their lips are starting to turn blue. What do you do? This happened to me 2 summers ago. Right, now, I'll say, I've had first aid and training, but it's been a little while. So when I noticed that I saw this child at my table, obviously choking, I'm thinking, I don't know how to do that. I thought immediately of Stephanie. So Stephanie Yoder goes to my church, and I know she's a nurse practitioner. Stephanie is what I said. I knew she was in the kitchen. So that's what I said. I got up right away and said, Stephanie! And I looked in the child's mouth to see if, you can swipe or whatever, but I didn't remember all the policies. So who are the people in your church, right? We have doctor, we have a doctor, we have lots of nurses, nurse practitioners, we have people, we have first responders, we have those people, and I'm sure you guys do too. So let's name them. Who are the people in your church that you can stand up and yell their name if this situation happens to you? Who would you yell? Denise. Yes, absolutely. Who else? Andy Ray. John Friesen, good, yes.
But none of those people would be here on Wednesday night.
Okay, who would be?
So who won? Andy Mike. Donna.
Good.
Okay, Donna, it's all you.
If you don't have people who are regularly here when you're feeding children, you might ought to consider, should we have a couple people go and do a first aid training? Should we get comfortable doing the Heimlich? Stephanie came over and did it like a pro and was not nervous. I was, it took me a while for my adrenaline to stop flowing. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew who to call. I knew who to ask, right? It's not that all of us need to know how to do the Heimlich or practice it, right? We don't all need to do that, but we need to know who to ask. We need to know who to call on. All right, scenario number 2. During class, one of your students always wants to sit on your lap. What should you do?
Say, I can't hold you right now.
Have them sit next to you.
Yes.
This morning.
Now, how old are your kids in your class?
3 and 4-year-olds.
Now, 3 and 4-year-olds, right? This is a tricky one, right? So it depends. If you have a high school student wanting to sit on your lap, obviously not okay. But if we're talking about that, 2 to 4-year-old class, some of them really need that, right? So one kind of general policy that I think is helpful for me, if a child is of the size that you would pick them up and hold them because they're small enough, then they're probably fine sitting on your lap, and that's okay.
But they can't all sit on your lap. If you have one.
No, they can't. You are right. And so sitting right here beside me or taking turns, yeah, that's a good policy. Yes, exactly. But if a child is too large that you wouldn't pick them up and because they're too big or too heavy, then that's also a child who really doesn't need to sit on your lap. Like let's say it's sometimes on the first few Sundays, they just need that reassurance and those kinds of things. Giving them some extra physical touch may be okay, but just think about that, right? And you're exactly right, that sit right here, you can sit right beside me, or everybody pull your chairs as close as you can, right? Those kinds of things can help us get to that. Good. Scenario number 3, while doing a craft project, one of your students grabs an adult pair of scissors and proceeds to accidentally cut their finger. Where can you go to find a first aid kit? At the office? Oh, the ed office. Okay. Very good. Everybody knows where that is? Excellent. Is it stocked? I went to get a Band-Aid out of our first aid kit a couple of months ago, and there were only this little, child had a tiny little finger with a cut on it, but all I could find was this monster Band-Aid. It worked, but it stopped the bleeding, I guess. But anyway,
Also,
make sure they're
in-
stocked.
In the kitchenette of the basement, for anyone that's working with you downstairs, in one of the cabinets, I think it's the far left one.
Next scenario, one day after class, one of your students tells you that someone has made them feel bad and afraid. What do you do? Yes, tell me more about that. What, you guys are so good. What a great idea. Where did you hear that question? Yes, tell me more about that. What do you mean by that, right? Those are some good non-leading questions you can ask. Good. Last scenario, one of your students begins acting very differently halfway through the semester. What should you do?
Ask a parent.
Yeah. Ask a parent or another adult that you know that knows that child. What's going on? We've had a lot of babies born in our church in the last year, and so their older siblings are acting a little different, right? There's some behavior change that happens in children when there's a significant life event. So ask a parent or another person, another teacher even. I don't know how you guys do it here, but we have generally 2 teachers in a classroom. Ask the other adult or the teacher who teaches them on Wednesday night if it's not the same person. Have you noticed? Do you know if there's anything going on? Who should we ask? Who should we talk to? Pay attention to those. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So would best practice be to go to family members first, or would best practice be to go to a non-family member first?
That's yeah.
Sunday versus Wednesday, or I don't know, school versus church or something.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I can say from any organization's point of view. I'll say from my point of view, I would ask your other teacher first. I would say it's not a bad policy to ask a parent, especially if this is a family that's a part of your church and you know them. If it's a child that's coming and you don't know their family dynamics, there's possibility there that there's lots of things that could happen there if you're asking an adult when you don't know the situation. So I would start with another person who interacts with that child.
That's right, I was just say it gets trickier when they turn 12, 13, 14.
They act weird all the time then, right? I have a 12-year-old boy. Oh my gracious. Yeah, they do. Right, exactly. So finding a teacher or someone else that you can trust and that knows the child, just ask some general questions. I'm going to wrap us up with just a quick story. And then if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to have more conversation if you'd like. So I'm just going to share a little story about a village that had a school built on the top of a mountain at the edge of a cliff. And it was a very good school, and the kids were taught well. But sometimes when they would come to school, or after school, or when they'd play at recess, one of the children would get just a little too close to the edge of that cliff and they would fall. And when the child fell, they would be injured or hurt in some way, right? And so the people would have to go down and they have to get the child and they have to take them to the clinic, but the clinic was in the next town, right? And sometimes the child would be in a lot of pain or would be lost along the way. So the people of the town said, hey, we have got to do something about this. We can't be having our children falling and getting hurt when they're just going to school, right? So they asked themselves, what are we going to do about this tragedy? Well, they decided that they would build a clinic at the bottom of the cliff so that when a child fell, they'd be able to get them to a clinic right away, right? And save their life. But there was another voice in the town that said, we don't really need a clinic at the bottom of the hill. We need a fence at the top of the hill. A good, strong fence, right? That would keep those children from falling in the first place. But do you know what happened? So many people got excited about building that clinic at the bottom of the hill that that's what most people started working on. But there were just a few in the town who began the work of building the fence. The work of prevention or fence building that we're talking about today isn't really popular work or glamorous work in any way, right? But it's so, so important. So I thank you so much for participating with me today and staying awake and having this conversation together, and for the way that you invest in the lives of the children in your congregation. All right. Well, thanks so much for letting me come and share with you guys. I enjoyed it.